All right, ladies and gentlemen. So you've watched us so far, and I've been looking forward to this particular panel that we are about to begin, because we're going to be talking to people who have been really involved, not only in 9/11 truth, but also other issues around the world. And I really think that is so relevant to the topics we're going to be talking about today, which is mainly going to focus on 9/11's impact on the world, which we know it has had a major impact on so many aspects of daily life, not only here in the United States, but what happened in the U.S.'s strategy, foreign policy strategy afterwards, and also how 9/11 truth fits into the bigger picture and where do we go from here. So let me go ahead and bring on our panelists. Our first one is Anthony Hall. He is an emeritus professor of liberal education and globalization studies at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, and editor-in-chief of the American Herald Tribune. He has written extensively on world affairs, including the situation in Palestine, which is blinking red and has been for the past year or so. His Substack, I just want to make sure I mention this, a lot of great writing there, is substack.com/@Anthony James Hall. We'll have that linked up at 911freefall.com. But thank you for joining us, sir. And he is going to be joined by Barrie Zwicker, who is an author, producer, and social and political activist, specializing in media and criticism since 1970. Since the events of 9/11, he's become a leader in the 9/11 truth movement, authoring a book called Towers of Deception, The Media Cover-Up of 9/11. That won gold in the current events category of the 2007 Independent Publisher Awards. Prior to 1970, he was an award-winning newspaper writer for the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Detroit News, other newspapers. His commentary, Facing the Fourth Estate, was aired weekly on Vision TV. It was at 18 CBC stations. He taught journalism for 7 years at Ryerson University and worked for 15 years at Vision TV. I want to make sure I get that right. Finishing with his own weekly program called Media File. In 2002, he produced a video that had a huge impact on me and waking me up and getting me involved in this movement. It was called The Great Deception. And in 2004, The Great Conspiracy, the 9/11 news special you never saw. Thank you for joining us for this panel, sir. And they're going to be joined by Kelly David. She is currently a financial educator. She is also the vice president and board treasurer for Palestine charity team. They're helping the people suffering in that conflict, which I think is probably going to come up in this discussion today. Formerly, though, she was the chief operating officer and a board member here at AE911 Truth, and she was the driving force on this team that led us to the strength and success that we had in the last decade as we deal with this very difficult mission. We couldn't have done that without her. So thank you for joining us, Kelly. And of course, this guy I've never met before, never had on my show, Mr. Craig McKee. He's been a journalist in Montreal for 30 years, covering news and entertainment, won 8 provincial and national newspaper awards. He writes and edits for us here at AE911 Truth, and he also writes for his blogs Truth and Shadows and Thought Crimes and Misdemeanors. He also hosts a podcast that is called Truth and Shadows that everyone here should definitely check out after watching the 24th hour. So, Craig, thank you for joining us for this important panel.
Glad to be here, Andy.
All right. So I am going to just kind of get us all started. There's a lot to talk about, and we're going to take the full hour with this one today because I want to hear what everyone here thinks about 9/11, 23 years later. You know, every year I mark what the post 9/11 world is at in the course of a regular lifespan. So at 18 years, it was old enough to vote, go to war. After 16 years, it could drive a car. 21 years, it was old enough to drink. And I don't know what kind of hallmark we face at 23 years, but it is starting to get up there. So my first question, this is something people in our audience and their own activism may wonder about themselves, and I'm sure we've all asked ourselves, 9/11 truth and getting involved in world issues in general, dedicating so much time, effort, and energy into this. Why did we start doing this in the first place? And then why do others continue to do this, even though we run up against these obstacles and a lot of just problems and trying to get our message out and trying to help the people of the world? Why do we still do this after all this time?
Well, maybe I should open because there was silence there for a minute.
Yeah, go for it, Barrie.
I'm not as involved in 9/11 truth activities as I was. My interest is sincere and ongoing, and actually, I did a disservice to my late wife in that I actually I was on to 9/11 the very day of it, and that's the truth, and I have witnesses. But I went ahead and made a public statement that I was going to devote the rest of my life to 9/11 truth. And I didn't ask my wife what she thought about that. Anyway, she was good. She came around. She was like ordinary public to begin with. She believed what she was seeing on the TV, and I was seeing on the TV. I started to believe it on the 9/11, and because of my longtime interest in aviation. And I just came back from taking a hop in a tiger moth yesterday. I went up for 40 minutes in a tiger moth. I really interested in aviation. And because I was asking out loud, where's the US Air Force? As we're watching airplanes going all over Hell's Half Acre in the USA with allegedly people in them who are capturing them and forcing them to fly to New York and everything. And I got on my feet and I'm saying, come on, US Air Force, come on, US Air Force, this is urgent. Where are you, US Air Force? And then it dawned on me, there's something totally fishy here. U.S. Air Force scrambles in 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. No U.S. Air Force for almost an hour. Didn't even get to New York City. Turned out they came from Otis Air Force Base and they were sent out to do lazy figure eights over the Atlantic. And so before 9/11, before noon on 9/11, I said, this is a Reichstag fire 2001. So, but then what happened was that my whole life was interrupted, not in a bad way, by 9/11. I had started a cross Canada bicycle ride in 2000. I started off in Sydney, BC, and I rode my bike off-road as much as possible with a trailer to Calgary on my first leg. And then I did my second leg from Calgary to Toronto. And then 9/11 hit, and I didn't do any cycling cross Canada for a long time. I did finally finish the cross Canada cycling tour. Forget what year it was, but I got to Halifax. I did it in 6 legs. One of them was cut short because outside of Peterborough, I suffered a really bad crash and I had to go to the hospital and then go home. But I've retained my interest in 9/11, and yet these days I'll be 90 in November, and I'm trying to write my memoir and take care of my daughter who has severe MS, and I spend 3 days a week being the main family caregiver. And so I can't do much except come on panels like this of insiders who are interested in talking about strategy and so on. But I'll finish off, because I've already taken enough time, by saying that really I have a couple, and I made some notes, I may glance over at them. I have a couple of main thoughts. And in a nutshell, my main thought is how long it takes, especially in the cases of state-run false flag deceptions, and often state-run mass murders, before justice is served. And I was doing just a wee bit of research today before we started, and came across how a person whose father was killed in Chile. And remember, there's a tie-in with 9/11 of 1973, when there was the takeover by Augusto Pinochet. And in the particular story I ran across today, it's been 40 years that the family of the man killed by Pinochet's people have started to get some justice. And the justice started because an Italian court took an interest in it, an Italian court. And that would be because of a particular judge. And I'm thinking about Pearl Harbor, and I did a little research on that. Yes, there was an investigation after Pearl Harbor around 1945-46 as to what was it all about. But you know, the truth never came out about Pearl Harbor, as the truth was so well laid out in Day of Deceit by Robert B. Stinnett. And it took him 7 years to write that book. And still, most people in the USA and around the world accept the official story of Pearl Harbor, which of course is true, that the Japanese warship steamed toward Pearl Harbor and conducted this terrible attack. But FDR knew all about it the whole time and arranged that nobody would interfere with that bunch of Japanese battleships steaming toward Pearl Harbor. It was, and one of the generals, MacArthur, he said, "Hey, we've got to tell the world about this." No, MacArthur was told, "Shut your mouth up right now, because we want to let that fleet come and attack Pearl Harbor." And of course, eventually that was a good thing. That was one of the good types of false flag operations, because it just mobilized the American public. It's 1941 now. The war's been going on for 2 years, and the United States has done bugger all. So, you know, that you could justify FDR and what he did in the cover-up, which is a kind of false flag operation. You know, you either make it happen or you let it happen. Pearl Harbor was a let it happen false flag operation.
And that's a good point. I want to just jump in and ask this, though, because, you know, every time I bring people on and we talk about 9/11, but most guests can cite so many instances where there was deception going on behind world events. And it makes me think it's almost like some kind of like Godfather or something. Like you end up in this world, this kind of sleazy world of other mafia dons, and the only way that you can stay alive and compete is by doing the same awful stuff that they're doing. Tony, from your own research of world events and such, can a nation manage to stay alive unless they're doing the same awful things that their peer nations are doing? I know that sounds like an incredibly cynical outlook, but I mean, is there any space for a government to be able to thrive and not be overthrown or have something really awful happen to it because they got in some other country's way? Can they do this without pulling off some kinds of deceptions such as 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or whatever you want to name?
Well, I'm thinking that you, Andy, have spent most of your life after you've been alive after 9/11, and it strikes me that's the kind of question that might occur to you. The question that occurs to me is, can you just deny? How far can you go in denying reality, creating an illusional reality that cuts against the evidence of what really happened, and leave people in the lurch so they don't really know what the world is constructed, how the world is constructed? How long can you survive in this kind of world that we're in now, where, no matter how hard you try, you're still at sea wondering what is true and what isn't? Because we know since 9/11, when it was demonstrated what you could get away with, the scale of the lie you could tell. And then as long as you had mainstream media and government figures and celebrities and whatnot backing it up, it would be acceptable. So to me, the people who refuse to look at 9/11, I figure if you don't know now, too bad. I'm tired of like begging, or the idea we need to beg and get on our hands and knees and plead people to do some research. And I become contemptuous, really, at people who try to present a view of contemporary geopolitics in the world, dealing with anything, and act as if there's a consensus about what happened on 9/11, that everybody agrees, and it has something to do with Islamic terrorism and nothing to do with the Project for the New American Century and Zionist American objectives to get everybody hating Muslims. I did a piece, 20,000 word piece on Chomsky, who, because he wrote that little book and because he had such enormous prestige, steered people away from 9/11, studying it, and made it seem almost like an embarrassment for people to be doing that, somehow that they lost it, that they were doing something antisocial and maybe destructive to society. Yeah. And for some reason, that essay was taken off. You introduced me, Andy, as the editor-in-chief of American Herald Tribune. You might be interested that website was taken down by the FBI, was not censored or not put on the back burner, but made to disappear, and all the archives disappeared by something called the FBI, which is an extension of the Department of Justice. So anyway, I've had a lot of hits for doing 9/11 at the university or that issue, so Chris Hedges comes to mind as somebody who presents a worldview, a big picture worldview. And he focuses a lot on the treatment of the Palestinians. And nowadays, if you say, I'm going to look at the manipulation of society so that people could get away with the hits on the genocide of Palestinians, and you don't look at the events of 9/11, there are many reasons it was done, but it has a lot to do with turning public opinion in the world, toxifying people's brains against Muslims, against Al-Qaeda, against Osama bin Laden. And, if people are going around the world presenting themselves as if they adhere to this, they're not respectable. And so, I take it we've won. The demonstration is the media just has unlimited control, that if they continue to keep an orchestrated view of the lie, there's really not much you can do. And we saw it with coronavirus. We're seeing it now with Gaza in a slightly different way. If the media sticks together, which they're not now on Gaza totally sticking together, you can just get away with murder. I'll leave it at that.
So, Kelly, I'm going to turn to you for this too, because you're involved with Palestine Charity Team. You've been in the trenches here at AE911Truth with us, and you've seen the obstacles that we run into here. I see the fact that there's a war in Palestine mentioned on TV. A lot of coverage is very slanted towards the unholy land, the Israel there. But do you see the same kind of obstacles that we ran into here at AE when you're doing stuff, not just with Palestine Charity Team, but just in the coverage overall of the conflict?
What do you mean specifically? The same issues as AE? The
censorship, demeaning language, speaking about our side of things, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's basically identical to what it was with 9/11. I was involved with Palestine Charity Team when I was still involved with AE as well. Yeah, it's the exact same issues. The censorship is the same. And I think you said it really well, Tony. And that was my whole thing. And I've been saying this since all of this started in Gaza. If it weren't for 9/11, I don't think as many Americans would be as brainwashed right now in the situation if 9/11 hadn't happened. Especially, I would say, like, for the, you mentioned how, Andy and I were 22 when 9/11 happened, and now, we're 45. So it's like, yeah, it's like almost equal amount of time before and after. but yeah, no, that's one of the things I noticed, you know, especially with a lot of people in my family who are in the baby boomer generation. They just, a lot of them just watch the news. They read the newspaper. They don't do any of their own research. My father is one of them, unfortunately, doesn't do any of his own research. And I've seen it firsthand, what it can do to someone who will only look at the TV and watch, and he just watches the news all day long and reads every newspaper all day long, and he feels like he's well informed. And I really believe that he and other relatives of mine who are around the same age as him, I really believe if it weren't for 9/11, they would see it differently. It's that terror, is the shock of what we experienced as Americans on 9/11, and you know, all of our situations is different. Barry, I was like you. I knew on day one too. On day one, I knew that this couldn't. My first words out of my mouth were, "There's no way our intelligence didn't get wind of this. Like, this is impossible." And the second thing I said was, "They're going to blame the Muslims." So I knew as well. So yeah, I think because of 9/11. That's how it started. And a lot of people who were alive and adults on 9/11 who completely accepted that side of the story, they see it, because of the way they've kind of mixed things up in the media. And especially, like, for example, in 2003, they made it seem like Iraq had something to do with 9/11. And they just twisted the words around very carefully to make it seem like, well, this war on terror, we have to do this. It's pretty much like the exact same thing. It's their way of just kind of connecting any group. They're a terrorist organization, and that's it. And most people who just watch the news and things like that think, oh my God, another terrorist, look what they did to us, all that trauma we went through on 9/11. And then they just, you know, say things like, I'm pro-Israel, just to say that, when they really don't even know what exactly is going on. That's my thoughts on that.
Well, yeah. And we've seen a lot of changes in the society. There are certain aspects of society that I noticed back before September 11th growing up that I miss from those days. One of the things that I miss the most is the lack of, I mean, there was national dramas that would happen. You know, you had Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, you had O.J. Simpson, and, you know, but these were things that happened to somebody else, and you just followed it because it was interesting. Even if it got silly. But now after 9/11, it was like you'd have these national crises that they would say, we're all in this together. And to a certain extent, it's like, yeah, they are, because it's affecting your day-to-day life. And it just, the drama got heaped on more and more, where we had the disease of unknown origin back in 2020 around that election time. And now they're talking about monkeypox. I have a friend who's kind of a hypochondriac and calls me about every disease that's coming down the pike. And, you know, but this is something, you know, that potentially it could be used to accomplish some of the same ends. And so it's like, I've seen this escalation of these national dramas, and the way they get away with doing this and whipping everybody up and getting them dialed into it is through the mainstream media. I mean, watching the news became like going to work. Like, you feel like you're doing something, even if you're unemployed and sitting in your underwear. You feel like, you know, watching MSNBC. I'm on top of all of these things here. And I don't know if this is, number one, healthy for people, but also it's a great way to keep people just kind of on their feet, on the edge, and involved in the drama and compliant. So, I mean, that's my biggest thing that I've noticed about changed in the society, is that it just seems like this, we're in this together and we all need to comply attitude just went into overdrive. I mean, Craig, what do you think about that? You've heard me rant about these things offline for years. What's your opinion?
Well, I certainly think that the mainstream media today is almost cartoonish when you compare it to what the media. I mean, the media had there was propaganda in the mainstream media going back many decades for sure, but I remember, and some of it I don't remember firsthand, but I remember the Kennedy assassination and some of the debates on television about that, and some of them I've just sort of seen on video in years since. I do remember some of it from the time, even though I was just a kid at the time. But it's you could have some honest exchanges on television in the 1960s. I remember William F. Buckley having Noam Chomsky on his show Firing Line to talk about Vietnam, and whatever's happened to Noam Chomsky since, I think that's Tony mentioned that it's perplexing what the things that he's saying in recent years. Not only about 9/11, but about the Kennedy assassination. He thinks that's all crazy. And, I think he wanted to round up unvaccinated people and put them in camps. I think something like that. So he's completely lost all credibility that he had. But in the 1960s, if you can find it on YouTube, it's fascinating to watch him and Buckley and Chomsky go head to head about Vietnam. And I think to myself, you would never get that discussion on television today. You just wouldn't get it. Today, it's instead of, propaganda having a significant role in the media, which I think it has had for a very long time. Today, it's all propaganda. It's almost wall-to-wall propaganda. And unfortunately, that's the biggest obstacle that we face. Whether it's 9/11 or whether it's Gaza or whether, and many different things that have happened since 9/11 that I think are also false flags, is that if people are not prepared to doubt, then they think they're informed just by kind of absorbing. And it's not even just consuming media. Sometimes it's just kind of absorbing it secondhand or what their friends are saying. And I mean, you just have to look at the coverage of the election. I mean, it's all just, it's to say it's partisan is not even strong enough. I mean, the MSNBC and CNN are just kind of, it's straight partisan, propaganda. That's the only way to put it. So this is the environment that we're operating in to try to wake people up. But I would say there are some positive signs. And the 9/11 was such a big event that it has caused a portion of the population to wake up to the lies of the deep state. And I think COVID did this as well. And I think there's a lot less trust in the mainstream media today than ever before, and a lot less trust in government. But unfortunately, it's still to get people to focus that distrust, and to take a little bit of time to do some of their own research is a really hard sell. But and this is something we can also get into. There are hopeful signs recently where 9/11 is concerned that it's starting to get talked about a little bit by some reasonably mainstream people. People like Tucker Carlson and Russell Brand and Jimmy Dore and Candace Owens is another one that's talking about. So these people are not on NBC necessarily, but they're pretty well known commentators, and those types of people are starting to talk about this now. So it's almost as if a certain length of time goes by, and then these things become safer the deep state's willing to let those things come out a little bit more because they've moved on to the next thing. But as far as 9/11 itself goes, there is a little bit of reason to have hope there, because just the fact that those people are willing to talk about it suggests that people are willing to hear that their government could be lying to them about something major. And, so hopefully we can just build on that.
Yeah, but see, the problem is that when you say, oh my God, Tucker Carlson came out and said this supportive of us, you'll have half the audience say, oh, he's an evil conservative. Or if somebody on the other side comes out and says the exact same thing, that's that evil liberal. And frankly, I don't need to have the whole buffalo here. I can just get this one thing of agreement with this person. And even if I don't like the person's politics and other issues, you know, it's still good that I spoke out about this, you know, one issue that's really important and still has an impact on our world today. So just, I'll throw this out to whoever wants to take it, but the political polarization, you know, Craig said this on Freefall, my show, about how the election of Donald Trump, having nothing to do with what you think about Donald Trump, just the fact that this guy is such a lightning rod, such a polarizing figure, created a huge distraction in this country. And within the 9/11 truth movement. Now everything is put through this prism of like, okay, so they agree with us about 9/11, but what do they, you know, what's the rest of their politics look like? Which we didn't have to deal with that before. It just introduced this new element into the ecosystem of activism. Well, nobody has to be in lockstep. We also don't have to be we don't have to be united either, but we don't want to be divided and conquer. The best thing to do is figure out what you out there believe, whatever you're passionate about taking action on, and the truth will be sorted out from millions of people doing those individual things. Small things done well every day are going to change the world. But guys, thank you so much for coming on this panel and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.